Welcome to the 47th episode of the First Person Podcast, and happy Pride Month to everybody. This episode, we're going to be looking at and talking about queer representation in gaming. Whether it be queer theming, queer performativity, or explicitly queer characters, we want to try and open up the conversation a bit more, looking at the way gaming media frames queer values and narratives. Join us as we look into both mainstream and indie games and discuss our experiences with them. So, just before we jump into the heat of it, who the heck is everybody, and what have you been playing recently?
Hey, I'm Patrick. I'm the managing editor at FPS and head of essays, and I've been playing and very much enjoying both Spiritfarer, which is like if you haven't heard about it, it's kind of like a cozy sim game, like Stardew and Animal Crossing, but you're on a boat, and you're Chiron, the person who brings dead people to the afterlife. But then there's also platforming, but it's also like a sweet game. And I've also been playing a game that's been getting pretty poor reviews, Biomutant, which is actually a pretty fun game. And I was actually complaining to my partner about how good it was. And I say complaining because it was getting all these bad reviews, but I'm like, this is like a game that's like way better than something like, Assassin's Creed Valhalla that got like 80s, whereas this has been getting like 50s and 60s. And it's weird. It has its issues because it's kind of like a Mindy game. Like it's like not quite AAA studio. It's a more indie studio, even though it's published by THQ Nordic. But so it's not a perfect game, but it's a pretty fantastically weird game where you play like a little rat fox and go through the post-apocalypse. But yeah, that's what I've been playing.
I'm Alex Chalk, head of commentaries. I have been playing not much, actually. I've been sort of passively plugging away at that re-release of Shin Megami Tensei 3, which is, like other Shin Megami Tensei games I've played, delightful and has like a really special and like unique mood to it. Like those games are really bleak and sort of nihilistic in ways that I find, I don't know, I haven't seen much in other video games. And there's also this sort of absurd humor to a lot of the things in those games that I find really charming. But they're also hard as hell, and it plays like a PS2 JRPG, which makes it hard to play it for long periods of time. But overall, enjoying that game, I think. Very excited for SMT5.
All right, and my name is Giuseppe Femia. I am the podcast producer, and I've been playing. I played through Tranzone, and if you got it around last year about this time, there was a racial justice bundle, and Tranzone was one of the games in that, and it took me a year because I think there were like 1,000 something games, and it took me a year to actually get around to this game. And it's made by two trans women, and they tell a story about this person who ends up in the trans zone, and you go and you interact with a bunch of different people, and if the interactions are positive, then they will give you hormone pills, and that can help you along the way. And it's kind of this positive reinforcement that you get for transitioning, because as you're going through it, people like compliment you on how you look, and you'll have like statistics of like how you feel, and I thought that was pretty cool. But that's one of the main things that we're going to be talking about today, with the first question being, what do we typically look for in terms of representation, especially in terms of queer representation?
I can take a first stab at this if we would like that. I feel like it's bad practice for me to open up with the contrarian Alex take. But this is what I'm bringing in today. I have yet to find, like a lot of things I'm going to be talking about today, this is partially coming from my experiences as a gay man. One thing I find I see a lot in games is like gay relationships that feel like they're meant to sort of fill a void, right, in a sort of representational gap that end up making me cringe so badly that I'd rather they not be there at all. And so to skip over the part where anyone has anything nice to say about things, one thing I'd like to see queer representation in games is, I think, a sort of willingness to dwell in, I don't want to say the oppositionality of queerness, but to embrace, that sort of crucial ingredient of difference, and to really dwell there and not to worry about making itself legible to heterosexuals, which is what I think a lot of, especially in AAA, I'm really talking about AAA here, but especially in AAA gaming, I feel like a lot of the queer representation you see is designed to make itself palatable, more than anything palatable, first, and second, understandable to heterosexuals. And so I think what you end up getting, well, and also cisgender individuals, and things like that, what I think you end up getting, instead of these sort of thoughtful and challenging examinations of sort of queerness and queer lives, what I think you end up with is this sort of thing where we're like being queer, we're being gay, we're being transgender, we're being bisexual, etc., is kind of just like a shirt you can put on for this one sex scene, which is the thing that really bugs me. I just dropped a lot there, so I'm going to shut up.
So what you're getting at is you would more or less prefer queer games designed by queer game designers for the purpose of actually like showing and engaging queer media. And
This is maybe a sort of like iffy death of the author take here. I think it's great if the person writing my queer media is queer, but if a non-queer person can do it and they can do it well, more power to them. That means something in the conversation is working, right? It means that people not from those backgrounds are able to sort of actually imagine and think through those other ways of sort of living and engaging with society, etc. So I don't know that it's actually, I'm going to make it a demand that queer media needs to be made by the people, at least the specific people it's claiming to represent. I think there should be queer people making games, both queer and not queer, or both games that are sort of overtly about queer topics and games that are not. Likewise, I don't want to do that sort of pigeonholing where, because for instance, you're the gay guy in your cohort, so you're the one who's doing the gay studies thesis, etc. That's not a requirement. I think it's good and I think it's important. But I think the main thing is just a willingness, wherever you're coming from, to, I don't know.
Are you maybe saying, like, could they at least talk to a queer person before they kind of bring it out to the world, not like their other straight friends, and be like, is this alien hot, and could think they could do scenes?
I
Or
mean,
I
I
don't know.
don't really know, because I don't know I don't know enough about the pipeline, right? In these instances, I don't know who vets, the kind of, like, to put a sort of material example behind it. I remember when my husband was playing Assassin's Creed Odyssey, a game I had absolutely no interest in. That game has a number of romances. I think none of the romances are sort of gender gated, right? Like, every romantic option is open to your protagonist, whether you take Alexios or Cassandra. And he was, or maybe they are. I don't actually think that's important. The point is, he was playing as Alexios and he was romancing Assassin's Creed Odyssey, spoilers, I guess, romancing, who was it? Alcibiades. And it was like the dumbest, most hackneyed romance writing imaginable, where it was like, ha ha ha, some phallic imagery. Well, what about your phallic imagery? What if we crossed swords? Yes, let's battle on this mountain. And then you literally have to fight him, and then if you beat him enough, he's like, let's fuck on this mountain. Sorry, I don't know if I can say that word. Let's boink on this mountain. And it was just like, it just, I don't know if it was a straight person's idea of gay romance, or if it was like, we actually can't, we actually have to make this scene compatible with both female and male Alexios. So we're just going to have this like generic dialogue. I think for me, it was just the idea that, like, this isn't a moment. It's like contained. There we go. This is the essence of my issue. I've found it. It only took me 20 minutes. I think a lot of sort of queer options in games generally tend to limit them to romance. This is the thing I've been sort of struggling to put a finger on. And so like you can be Shepard and you can like bang this alien or that alien, and that's sort of the extent of your experience of queerness as that character. And I think that that comes from an ideology that I associate with heterosexuals mostly, where it's like, well, why can't we all, isn't it all kind of the same thing? Where it's like, yeah, kind of. But also there are all these social social components, or like attraction is probably attraction, love is love, whatever you want to say around that, sure. But what isn't universal there is the sort of network of relations and social institutions and expectations and like pressures around one's romantic and sexual life. And I think that if you really want to do sort of justice to queer lives, you can't just be like, yeah, you can wear the gay shirt this time. And I'm not saying like, you need to put homophobia in your video games, but it would be interesting, I think, to have AAA games that actually, or not AAA games, because God knows the indie games are doing the good work. But to have more games that reckon with the ways in which it can be really, really scary to come out to someone, right? Which is something that, rather than just make it like, yeah, it's cool. Alexios bangs everyone and everyone bangs everyone because it's ancient Greece and no one cares about it and no one even talks about it really, except when they're banging each other. I think that like, in as much as we're interested in producing sort of representations that are positive and affirming, I think it can be really affirming to sort of show people that you understand what they've been through, right? That coming out of the closet is really difficult. That, for example, there's like a what do they call it? Like a plague, not plague, an epidemic of loneliness among gay men, because a lot of the sort of social institutions that people use to sort of develop meaningful relationships, like gay men feel are closed off to them. And so that sort of ties into, for example, the prevalence of hookup culture among gay men. And so games that are sort of affirming of maybe some of those other social pressures that aren't immediately about who you have a sort of romantic or sexual attraction to, but rather about what it means to be a romantic or sexual being in a given social context, is, I think, the thing I'd like to see more of. God, I'm sorry. I feel like I derailed this immediately.
No, that was very well said.
Yeah, really good point. Yeah, you definitely nailed it.
What I want to add into this, and it does touch on a similar topic, is that there is so with you, as you said, there's different shirts you can put on, and it kind of like it not dumbs it down, but it kind of like isolates the entire gay experience to romantic and sexual in video games. Uh, that is in to some degree a bit restrictive. And one of the things that I do want to touch on is that for an ace, I'm asexual for anyone who doesn't know this, but for a member of the ace community, there isn't really any kind of that performity that people would put in a game, like because of the fact that there isn't a steamy sex scene that would be affiliated with an asexual character, or this kind of understanding that they don't want to date, which isn't true for all ace people, but that kind of lack of performativity often makes so that there isn't any ace representation in gaming media. And there are two cases that I do want to talk about. None of them have to do with games, but the TV show House MD had an instance of a ace couple, and one of them turned out to have a health problem that was making his libido non-existent, and the other one was just faking being ace because she wanted to be with him. And that is the approach that many medical practitioners take to asexual people, and that's fucked up. And it doesn't really like show the actual like interactions that ace people would have, and it doesn't do people who identify as ace justice. But on the other end of the spectrum, there is Todd Vasquez from BoJack Horseman, and they actually explore his character, like realizing that he was asexual and like going through a lot of different themes and like stories with him to kind of like show the full extent of, not the full extent, but like an experience that someone who is part of the ace community could have. And I like that representation a lot more because obviously it doesn't hinge on like medical issues that this person could potentially have. Now with gaming media, because a lot of the time the AAA developers do want to kind of have that relatability. I don't like Ace. Ace isn't ever a very explicit thing that I have found to be the case for pretty much any character I've ever played, and that's I think where sort of reading between the lines has to come in. Like you have to like for me, for example, so a lot of people have an issue with this, but I am more advocative of it because for Halo, John 117, I advocate for Master Chief being Ace, but others don't, since his lack of sexuality has to do with the experiments performed on him as a child. But I think that his relationship with Cortana is one that could only ever be Ace due to the inability to have a sexual relationship, like even if he did have a libido. And on the one hand, it is problematic to base somebody's sexuality off of a physical disability or a physical injury that he took on as a child. But on the other hand, it is more about my own reading of the story because it was never stated that Master Chief would never have been Ace. So I don't want to do him the injustice of defaulting him to straight. So this is a form of kind of representation that I've created for in a character that I've grown up with and I've grown up to admire and love. And that is like a sweet kind of um, platonic interaction that he has with pretty much that Master Chief and Cortana have because they've been with each other for so long that they're the only ones that can really understand like the full extent of their own relationship. And I find that beautiful, and I find that more or less accurately represents somebody in an asexual relationship as I have been before. And obviously, this doesn't represent every instance of asexuality, but I find it does a good deal of justice to kind of imprint my own asexuality.
That's an interesting question. There is the one, like, this sort of touches on what seems to me a sort of interesting point of inflection in sort of fan discourses around gender generally, which is the sort of the or gender and sexuality, and which is the sort of fan reading. No, not that. Sorry, the sort of the place of the queer reading, right? Like what the sort of, if we want, these sort of more robustly representative regimes of I don't know if regime's the right word for it. If we want these sort of more robustly representative works, do we need it to have a sort of single authoritative meaning, or is it maybe more productive to allow for the sort of generation of oppositional readings? I mean, I don't know. I think that's sort of maybe a false binary. I think it's probably good to have works that both sort of directly hang around in these sort of more overtly queer spaces that sort of that don't just put it on their fans to queer them so that they can just keep selling things to straight people. At the same time, I do sort of, I think there is this sort of creative potency, right? Like a kind of an intractability, I think, to the queer reading that I find really interesting and really powerful. I hope that's not what I hope I'm not sort of undermining the argument you were making about Master Chief. I just really like the way you sort of argued that, like the way that you're sort of that sort of act of finding these productive gaps in the story and making them one's own. I don't. Am I sort of going down the wrong road with this, or I guess, Joey, I'll turn the question around to you. Like, do you think it's important that Master Chief be canonically Ace?
I don't know. Honestly, I think that it might be beneficial
Yeah.
for some people if he were canonically Ace and we had a definitive proof of it. But like at the same time, under what circumstances would he become Ace? Because there hasn't been a lot of talk throughout the series. So there'd be, on the one hand, it would be queer baiting for him to just all of a sudden become
Mm.
Ace, or they could just say nothing about it and continue the story as it is and let me have this sort of reparative reading that I've created for myself. And I think that if we are to try and navigate this, it would best be done in games that don't have like where the canon doesn't have to change, where like characters can be like headline, like not headline, but like
Mm.
new games can be created explicitly with asexual interactions in it. And that is something that you talked about just a moment ago, where the social context of being gay or being ace would be part of the forefront in that game. So uh, Master Chief is one of my favorite characters in terms of like first person shooters, but
Mhm.
they might not mean the same for everybody else. So does he need to be canonically ace? No, because this is my interpretation of it. And that comes along with a lot of like fan art or fan fiction that people write. They want to rearrange characters to fit a new narrative that they themselves create. And I think that that's kind of what I'm doing. I would be upset to see Bungie or whoever is developing the new Halo games have him turn out to be ace just a bit, because
Hmm.
that wouldn't be a sign that yes, I was right. That would be a sign as they now are doing this explicitly to bring in people who are asexual. And I find that making room for an ace relationship between a AI and a super soldier is just about as good as um, or better than just somebody calling themselves ace and wearing it like a shirt.
That's really interesting. That's really interesting. Just that point you made about um, how like you would I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth here, but you were sort of resented at this stage if they were to make that pivot. It would feel sort of if I'm understanding this correctly, like it would feel, I don't know if tokenizing is the word for it, or like patronizing maybe.
I'd say, yeah, it would be patronizing.
Yeah, and so I sort of have similar feelings to that. I think when it comes to gay stuff in games, where a lot of the times it feels like especially when in games like Mass Effect or which what am I talking about? I've barely played Mass Effect, but in the few games that I've played where there are romantic sort of gay romance options, there is an element of the tokenistic in it, or an element of the like ticking a box, or like, yes, we are aware that 10%, approximately 10% of our consumers might want this content, and so we shall put it in the game for them so that they will buy it. There, like, I'm sort of there's a certain form of sort of queer representation which I want to, I wish I could pronounce the trademark symbol to stick onto the end of that word, that feels very cynical to me, and is one that I, with that sort of that style of representation, that's like putting on a shirt, um, where it's about the character who's sort of sociosexual identity, is this sort of open cipher. It's this thing for you to fill in, rather than something that the makers of the game feel the need to engage with in any substantive form, or at best it's a punchy sex scene, which, as you point out, again, comes with a lot of problems in the ace context. But I think also what that comment brings up for me is how limiting sex is. I guess what no, not what how limiting sex is, but what a limited view a lot of these games tend to take on what sex is, which I think speaks to a lot of these issues, right? So that this notion that sex is this sort of discrete and nicely enclosed aspects of our life, I think speaks to a lot of the sort of issues around queer representation. Um, and so, the idea that you can just be gay in the bedroom, and then whatever, and then or in the rest of your life you're just a normal, you're just a normal, quote unquote, normal person. I'm trying to find a way to transition this into a conversation about Robert Yang, who I think does really good work on this sort of thing. Robert Yang is a game developer. I think he teaches, or used to teach, level design at the New School. I know he's living in New Zealand now. I don't know what he's doing there exactly. And he does a lot of these sort of gay themed micro games that are really challenging. Um, and I could talk about ways in which I've felt sort of represented by them, but I think the more interesting thing, um, to me about his games is actually the way that even I, as a gay man, have felt really challenged by them, and the way that Robert Yang is also a gay man, and the way that he's sort of willing, partially maybe because he has that positionality, to dwell in some of these sort of more ambiguous spaces around sexuality rather than just make it um, this, a punchy sex scene. And so I'm thinking of two of his games in particular. One of them is called Cobra Club, um, which I think is absolutely fascinating. So he does basically, it is a dick pic simulator where the first thing you do is you just like there's just like an extensive character creation for your character creation menu for your penis, and you just like sculpt your perfect penis in this game, and then you get to like frame the shot. You get to like frame the shot, choose the angle, whatever, like compose your artistic masterpiece dick pic, and then take the picture. And and then there's the gag. Like there's the part where it turns, which is that this game is actually connected to the internet, and when you take your picture, it is uploaded to a fake FBI website where it is posted alongside a bunch of other games, a bunch of other pictures that have been created using this game. Um, and so this was, I think, I don't remember if it was released or sort of incepted around the time that the Snowden leaks were first coming to light. So the idea of, like pervasive government surveillance of people's, private communications through digital technology. And it was sort of a commentary on that and the way that sort of intersects, I think, with gay life but also, I don't, clearly there's a certain sort of relevance of the dick pic to gay life, but I actually think it's a pretty sort of not specifically gay situation. I would assume that straight people send dick pics to, or straight men, or straight people presenting as straight men. There we go. Would send dick pics as well from time to time, and so it just becomes more. I think this really interesting exploration into the sort of like the way our sex lives are politicized and like tied into various institutions and structures of power, which I find really fascinating. And then the other one of his games that I really like is called Hurt Me Plenty. And this was a really interesting one because it comes out of, I don't know what his experiences are with kink, but it came out of some, I believe, perceived understanding or theory on kink that is not really a community or a sort of practice that I knew a lot about. And that's just about, it's almost like a sort of like BDSM 101 simulator where it's about, you know, it's sort of cartoonish. It's mostly about slapping a guy's ass over and over again, but also reading his like tells and body language in order to tell when you're sort of staying within the limits of the scenario and when you're actually sort of hurting him more than he wants to be hurt. And so it's about reading his body language, and then there's also um, there's the possibility of going too far, at which point he just sort of terminates it. He's like, nope, no more, we're done. And then there's actually an aftercare thing where this guy basically gives you feedback as you rub his back, and he tells you, this was good, or like, actually, you really hurt me, and I didn't like this, which was just sort of, again, not a way I think that we're used to seeing sex explored or discussed in games, and one that I think, I don't know, was really sort of enlightening and challenging to me in terms of like ways we can sort of think and talk about sex in games and beyond.
Nice. That actually leads in perfectly to the next question. It's what kind of themes do we see taking place in modern gaming media that support a queer narrative? And what you were talking about, it kind of fits it in terms of like boundaries and consent and stuff that we don't often see, even in straight sexual media, which is in itself problematic. But Patrick, in terms of like theming and stuff, you listed quite a few games here. Do you have anything to note about this question?
I was thinking like of the representation question in like games that support a queer narrative, and I think of like 2046 Read Only Memories. It's been a while since I've played a good chunk of this, but one thing I like about it is that, kind of to what Alex was saying, there are characters who are queer and very different identities, and that they are there's not really I feel like your character isn't. I don't know if your character is ever identified as like any kind of like identity or sexual orientation, but there are characters who like do represent a wide variety of identities, and it is addressed, and like difficulties around it are addressed, but they're not sort of parted out, despite sort of 2046 having that little like LGBTQ plus tag on Steam. It's not carted out like something like Dragon Age or Mass Effect series where they're like, we have gay people now, so
Mm.
I find it's very much kind of to I guess the solution of what Alex was talking about. Like, it is people making games that have queer themes, um that aren't just a t-shirt, that have characters, and that also kind of manage some intersectionality. Like, that's one thing that I feel like we can't really talk about is the intersectionality and identities that we ourselves don't have experience with or identify as. But like, I'm thinking of Iconfell, which, in addition to having like queer LGBTQ plus characters, is very much like um all about being careful. Like, there's content warnings you can that come on during gameplay of like homophobia or self-harm or that sort of thing. So I feel like it's more like a theme of, I guess, more responsible and more voices coming through. And these are, I guess, mostly indie games or commercial indie games.
I like the example of read-only memories. I hadn't thought about that game in a while, although I really enjoyed it when I played it. I don't think I finished it, and I don't remember, but I had a good time with it. One thing I think it does really well is sort of embed its its sort of explorations of gender and sexuality in its world, right? In its milieu. Like, it's because it's presenting what? It's like a sort of future or like alternate future version of San Francisco. So it's already got those sort of connotations of like um, you know, the San Francisco gay scene and all that. And on top of that, it's the sort of cyberpunk settings where people are able to sort of change their bodies, and where the body is a more fluid thing. And I think that in that game, a lot of those things sort of resonate with each other, right? Like a person's sort of position as gay, as bisexual, as trans, is sort of built on their access to these sort of more mutable technologies of the body, to this sort of more open and dynamic space when it comes to things like gender.
Hmm. And I also feel like they're not, unlike Dragon Age or Mass Effect or can't remember the other one you mentioned, but well, like, where it's, oh, the Assassin's Creed Odyssey, it's like not in like a, for lack of a better word, like post like prejudice world. Like,
Hmm.
there are the issues in there, and like, it's not like the end of the story in terms of queer representation is not like it's okay to be whatever. It's like, still things are still uneasy, and I feel like the Tranzone, which um Joey mentioned earlier, does a really good job about that, where you kind of start off, I can't remember if you've transitioned or are transitioning, but it is, you get positive feedback and you get hormones, but the whole kind of aesthetic is kind of uneasy, which I found
Hmm.
very interesting. And same for Dysphoria. Like, there's a bunch around that game, but also the end of Dysphoria is not like, yay, I've transitioned, it's happy. It's still uneasy. It's still like there's a lot to go, but there's a lot that's been covered as well.
The difference I like between Dysphoria and Tranzone is Dysphoria is like a single person's narrative, and this is their representation of their experience with the transition that they were doing. And with Tranzone, it starts off with you not having transition yet, and you still it starts off by saying what were you assigned as at birth, and what do you identify as, and throughout the game, as you do get home, you talk to people. There is that thing, but it opens up a more broad conversation as opposed to your own personal narrative, because pretty much everybody that you interact with is transitioning as well. And some people are like really psyched about it. Some people are good with like uh, how they're doing, how they're being treated. But then there's also people that are just like, oh, I regret transitioning. I didn't think that I thought that I would be happy if I were to do this, but it didn't work out for them, and that's unfortunate. Um, but then there's also people who are more, how should I say? There's a degree of bigotry with some of the characters where they won't address you like they won't talk to you as like enthusiastically if you do not uh, present yourself as a certain gender. I think there was one person that I interacted with, and they just kind of brushed me off when I was more looking more femme. But then later on, after I transitioned, they were very enthusiastic about talking to me. Or there were a couple instances in the city where they weren't, where there were people that didn't like androgynous looking people, um, because they still upheld that binary, and that opens up a more problematic a conversation that is still evident in the game, and that is partially what I enjoyed about it, because it's not just this simple, easy to solve question that everybody has and every trans person can do. But it's more of this very complicated social interaction and social atmosphere that informs and addresses every single aspect of the game. And I'm not a trans individual, so I do not have the authority to talk on behalf of the trans community. But this was my experience with the Tranzone, and for what it was. I came out of it with a better idea of the social conversation that's going on than I would have otherwise.
Yeah, you put it really well about the trans zone. There's also, yeah, like the class system between like people who live in the city and the people who don't live in the city. I am curious, Alex, to hear from you about The Sims.
Oh yeah. Um, yeah, so I guess for listener context, before we did this, we sort of made a list of games we were interested in talking about or touching on. And The Sims, I actually realized in making this game that I haven't played a lot of like quote unquote like queer games. Mm, I don't know, it's just not something I've explored very thoroughly in my in my engagements with gaming. Maybe more so in like books and film. But one of the two games I did list, or listed one, the works of Robert Yang, two, The Sims. The Sims is an interesting one for me because it was maybe the first environment in which I was able to sort of affirmingly explore what you might call a kind of gay domesticity, in a space that felt sort of free of judgment, or um, that sort of left me to think through, or that contextualized it in a sort of broader social context in a way that felt validating. It's like hard for me to talk about The Sims without also talking about Brokeback Mountain as the kind of like foil to it. Um, I think I'm probably not the only gay man who found um, Brokeback Mountain really upsetting to watch. When I watched it, I must have been around 18 or 19. This would have been around 2009. So it had been out for a few years at that point, and it was still the only sort of gay movie that I was aware of, like the only movie about gay people. And for anyone who hasn't seen Brokeback Mountain, I don't need to spoil that. Well, spoilers sort of. Look, it doesn't go great for them. It's a really sad movie, and I basically went from having like nothing on which I could sort of hang my brain, nothing on which to sort of hold on to for an idea of what it might be like to live as a gay man, beyond knowing that I was attracted to men and knowing that that was different. In terms of what that meant, sort of what it might mean to have a life where that was the case, I couldn't really imagine it. And so I watched that movie, not really knowing what it was going to be, um, as a way of starting to try to imagine that. And it was really upsetting to watch in that context because it's basically about two men who fall in love, only get to see each other about once a year, during which there's so much, they're so stressed out about what this means for the rest of their life. They mostly just fight with each other. And then one of them gets hate crime to death. And I'm not saying it's a bad movie, but I am saying it's not what I needed to see at that time in my life. And instead, what I ended up doing was playing a lot of The Sims 2, which is a game where I got to just play house with with often gay families who loved each other, and think about, like, all right, where are their kids getting from? Like, in some ways there wasn't much to think through, right? In some ways it was my way of playing through a sort of fairly classic straight neoliberal domesticity, but with different actors. But at the same time, it was sort of a really soothing entry point for that. It was a way in which I could at least begin to see myself in a life that didn't end, that wasn't abject. And I think that's the point that's sort of crucial here. Is it was maybe the first lens through which I was able to see myself as a gay man, as something that wasn't sort of doomed, as a person that wasn't sort of doomed to a life of loneliness and just sort of cursed by this part of myself that I was discovering, not to sort of find fulfillment in the way that many of my friends and family could expect to find. Um, eh, it's interesting to sort of think about this at the same time as we're talking about games or other works of media that sort of are willing to dwell in the ambiguities of of queer lives. And I certainly don't think all of them need to do all media needs to do all the things all the time. I think if anything, it underscores the necessity maybe of those works that are just kind of affirming. The ones who are like, no, 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 you can have a life, it's okay. Because yeah, that was definitely a game that was really dear to me, and a game that I would actually go back to a lot in times when I was sort of feeling down. Like if I was going through periods of depression or loneliness, I would often pick up The Sims again, just as a way of just sort of being like, all right, let's sink into like a warm, comfortable fantasy life for a bit, while my real one sort of goes through whatever it's going through.
I think that we already answered this last question pretty well. The question was, is the industry doing enough in terms of diversity or showing alternatives to heteronormative culture? And I would put forward that the fans are definitely doing enough, just in terms of like what we've been discovering and superimposing and creating for ourselves. But what do the two of you think?
I think they can always do more. I think
Ye-
AAA is not doing enough. They're just doing what Alex was talking about, putting the shirt on.
Yeah, I think it's hard. Yeah, on some level, I do kind of want to recognize that there have been advances of a kind, right? That we've gone from you know Duke Nukem talking about something chicks. I don't know, man. Like we've gone from an industry that used to be aggressively straight and aggressively male to one that, at least in pockets of it, is trying. And I don't want to give it a medal for that, but I guess I do want to sort of recognize that I do think there are no shortage of. I think there are stats that, like, there's game development is a disproportionately queer profession. There are a lot of queer people in it, both in AAA and in indie. And I want to sort of validate the work or recognize some of the work that queer people have done in the industry, including AAA, to get it, sort of engaging more with that material. I agree with both of you ultimately that there's a lot more work to be done. But I guess I just sort of wanted to end off, or not necessarily end off, but I wanted to, at least in passing, acknowledge that there are people in that industry who are clearly giving it their damnedest. And even if if the end product is this incredibly painful um, encounter between Alexios and Alcibiades on some stupid mountaintop, we wouldn't have been there a decade ago. So that's something, right?
Well, thank you both for giving your insights into this. And I'd like to just put it out there that we are not monoliths in this area. We don't have any right to speak on behalf of the entire queer community in terms of representation, but we are talking about our own experiences with it. And in terms of an academic context, it adds to the greater conversation that's happening. So, just in terms of putting ourselves out there. Thank you both for continue developing the conversation. Um, That being said, do we want to introduce ourselves one last time and then call it quits?
I am Patrick. I am the managing editor and head of essays at FPS, and you can also catch me every Monday at 3 p.m. Most Mondays at 3 p.m. Sometimes we take a break, like for CGSA, on twitch.tv/firstpersonscholar.
I'm Alex Chalk. I'm the head of commentaries. You can find me on Twitter at Alex_I_Chalk.
I'm Giuseppe Femia. I am the podcast producer, and you can find me on Twitter at _foolsbait. Thanks for listening to the First Person Podcast. Did we miss a game you really wanted to see trending? Let us know on Twitter at FPS Weekly, or start a conversation using the hashtag First Person Podcast on Twitter. First Person Podcast is produced by Giuseppe Femia and published by the Games Institute at the University of Waterloo.